The year was 1889. Ember Creek, Wyoming Territory. The wind dragged a long whistle through the grass, dry as bone, sharp as a knife drawn slow. The last light of the sun lay thin across the yard of the McCrae house, catching on the rust of a broken plow and the edge of a woman's torn dress. Lark Bennett lay half-turned in the dust, one hand bent beneath her face pressed to the earth like she was listening for something buried there. Beside her, a little girl clung tight to her arm. June, barefoot, her cheek smeared with soot and tears. The air itself seemed to hold still, heavy with the kind of silence that came after a scream had already been spent. From the porch above, shadows moved. The McCraes stood like stone, arms crossed, eyes narrow. The older woman's mouth tightened around a word she didn't say. One of the men spat over the rail, boots creaking as he shifted weight, watching the woman he'd thrown out like she was something he'd finished using. "She brought it on herself," someone muttered. Their words slid through the dusk, sharp as thorns. No one came forward to lift her, and that was worse than the beating. A neighbor passed by on the dirt road, hesitated when he saw the small shape crumpled near the steps. He adjusted his hat, looked away, and kept walking. His shadow stretched long and thin, swallowed by the fading sun. Lark's breathing was ragged, each gasp shallow, scraping at her throat. June pressed her face against her mother's sleeve, whispering in the broken rhythm of a child too young to name fear. The sky deepened toward amber. Dust shifted under a new sound. Hooves, steady and unhurried, rolling closer. A horse's breath came visible in the cool edge of the evening. The man who rode it sat tall and dark against the light. Broad shoulders, a felt hat low over his brow, a coat the color of the riverbank after rain. Ezekiel Cole, Zeke to those who'd ever dared speak his name, drew the reins and let the animal slow. He'd been returning from the ridge, the day's work still in his muscles, when the sight stopped him cold. A woman and a child, both half swallowed by dust, and a porch lined with faces that didn't care. He didn't speak. He just looked. The kind of look that stripped pretense away, left a man bare beneath his own deeds. Zeke swung down, boots crunching the dry ground. His horse shifted, exhaling through flared nostrils. The porch grew quieter, the onlookers suddenly still, unsure whether to sneer or shrink. He knelt beside the woman. Her hair stuck to her cheek, her pulse faint but stubborn beneath his fingertips. The child's small hand trembled against her mother's dress. He didn't touch either of them yet. He waited. Just a breath, maybe two, until her eyelids flickered, until she moved the smallest nod. Permission in the tremor of her chin. Then he slid his arms beneath her, slow, as if afraid she might break apart. June made no sound when he lifted her too, folding her into the curve of his coat. From the porch came the man's voice again. "She ain't yours, Cole." Zeke looked up, the twilight cutting half his face in gold, half in shadow. "Ain't anyone's now," he said low. Then he turned and carried them away from that house without another word. The trail from McCrae's place to Coal Ridge stretched 3 miles across open land. The sun dropped behind the hills, bleeding red into blue. Wind brushed over the grass, lifting dust that clung to the hem of his coat and the woman's hair. The child's hand clutched his collar, her eyes half closed. By the time they reached the small cabin at the edge of the creek, night had come full. Zeke pushed the door open with his shoulder. The scent of dry cedar and horses filled the space. He laid the woman down on the narrow bed by the hearth, covered her with a quilt patched by his mother's hands years ago. June hovered close, not letting go, her eyes wide under the kung lamplight. Zeke poured water from a kettle, dampened a cloth, and cleaned the streaks of dirt from the woman's face. Her breathing steadied, not much, but enough. He spoke once, quiet as if not meant to be heard. "You're safe here." Then he stepped back, giving the air between them space to breathe. Outside, coyotes called somewhere beyond the creek. The wind pushed at the shutters and carried a faint taste of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Zeke leaned against the doorframe, watching mother and child drift toward uneasy sleep. The firelight climbed the walls and touched the brim of his hat. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of a decision pressing down like a shadow long delayed. He'd brought them here, and the world would notice soon. He looked toward the window, where the last thread of daylight still clung to the sky, and thought of a name no one had spoken in years. Then he blew out the lamp. Morning slipped quiet over the ridge, soft as a prayer left half-spoken. The cabin breathed with the smell of cedar smoke and damp wool. A pale light spread across the floorboards, brushing the corner where Lark Bennett stirred beneath a quilt she didn't remember being covered with. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that her body didn't ache from the weight of someone's boot. The sound of metal against wood came from outside, a steady rhythm, not angry, not rushed. Zeke Cole was splitting kindling in the yard, his shoulders moving slow and even beneath the morning sun. Each strike of the axe sounded measured, like he was talking to the silence in another language. June lay curled near her mother, breathing small, even breaths. A thread of hair clung to her damp cheek. Lark brushed it aside and winced at the bruises blooming down her arm. She tried to sit, but her muscles fought her. The quilt slid, revealing a worn cotton nightdress. Hers, cleaned and mended. The sight made her throat tighten. When Zeke stepped inside, the door creaked, letting in the crisp air and the scent of hay. He paused just long enough for their eyes to meet. She looked away first. "You don't have to keep us," she said, her voice scraped thin. He didn't answer right off. He set the wood by the hearth, stirred the coals until the fire came alive again. "Didn't say I did," he replied quietly. Fire needed tending, same as people sometimes. There was no pity in it, and somehow that steadied her more than comfort would have. He poured black coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table. The smell drifted warm, sharp, grounding. "Drink if you can." Lark tried. The heat burned her lip, but it drew her back into her body. Her eyes followed him as he moved, how he kept a respectful distance, how he spoke only when needed. His silence wasn't cold. It felt careful. June woke with a start and sat up. For a heartbeat, fear flashed across her face, but then she saw her mother sitting upright and the man by the fire, and something in her small shoulders eased. She slid from the bed, padded to the door, and peered outside. A soft nicker came from the corral, followed by the sound of hooves in straw. Zeke nodded toward the open light. She can look if she wants. Horse won't harm her. Outside, the world widened again. Low hills, a strip of sky clean and blue, the faint shimmer of the creek beyond the pasture. The Mustang stood there, old and scarred, one eye clouded white, the other bright as flint. June reached out a cautious hand. The horse leaned forward, breathed her scent, then brushed its nose against her fingers. She laughed. Just a breath of sound, but it was laughter all the same. Lark stood in the doorway, watching. The morning air touched her face. It had been months since she'd heard her child laugh without fear. She wanted to hold on to that sound, press it into memory before it could fade. The moment was broken by a knock at the doorframe. Zeke turned. A woman stood there, older, wrapped in a brown shawl, gray hair pinned tight. Alma Boyd from the lower creek. She held a loaf of cornbread and a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Heard you took in some trouble," she said, not unkindly. Zeke's jaw worked once. "Heard right." Alma stepped inside, placed the bread on the table, and set down a string of carved wooden beads. "Shoshone work," she said softly. "They say it keeps peace in a house that's seen too much noise." Her gaze flicked to Lark, lingered just long enough to mean something more than words. Then she left, her boots fading down the path. Lark ran her thumb over the beads, smooth, cool, smelling faintly of pine. Why'd she do that? "Alma don't like ghosts hanging around," Zeke said, picking up the axe again. "Guess she figured you'd had your share." Lark almost smiled. It hurt to do it, but she did anyway. By midday, clouds gathered thin and gray, promising rain that hadn't yet come. Zeke moved through the chores with quiet precision, and Lark sat by the window, the beads coiled in her palm. Each time she blinked, the image of the McCrae porch flashed in her mind. Their eyes, their stillness. A tremor rose, but she pressed her hand over it. When Zeke returned with water from the well, she spoke, barely above a whisper. "You don't know me." He set the bucket down, met her eyes. "Don't need to. You're here now." Something in her chest loosened, the smallest breath of relief. But under it ran a thread of fear, of what would come when the town began to talk, when the McCraes came looking. Outside, the Mustang stomped once, uneasy, as thunder rolled far off in the hills. Lark turned toward the sound, her fingers tightening around the Shoshone beads. "Storm's coming," she murmured. Zeke looked at her, steady and calm. "Always does." He closed the door against the wind, and the latch clicked in the stillness. Dawn crept in slow, threading pale gold through the cracks of the shutters. A thin whistle of wind moved across the ridge, brushing the chimney, stirring the smell of coffee and cedar ash. Inside, the room held its quiet. Only the soft clink of tin against wood and the faint hiss of the kettle. Lark Bennett sat up, hair tangled against her cheek, quilt slipping from her shoulders. Sleep had left her heavy and sore, but the ache was cleaner now, like something washed and drying under sun. She saw Zeke's shape by the hearth, crouched over the fire, his back turned. The sound of pouring coffee filled the space between them. He said without looking, "You got some color back." "I don't feel like it." Her voice was dry, rough-edged. "Still counts," he replied, setting a tin cup near the bed. She studied his hands. Strong, scarred, steady as they adjusted the kettle's lid. They weren't the hands of a man who asked for much. That steadiness both unsettled and calmed her. June stirred beside her, mumbling half a word. The child's small hand searched, found her mother's sleeve, then settled again. Lark brushed June's hair with fingers that still trembled. Her gaze drifted to the door, where morning light pressed through the seam like a thin blade. She wanted to stand, to move, to feel her own weight again. When Zeke stepped outside to tend the horses, she pulled the quilt away and tried to rise. Her legs quivered, pain streaking up her side, but she caught herself on the bedpost. Pride was a stubborn thing. It had kept her alive in that McCrae house longer than reason should have allowed. She reached for the bucket by the wall, half filled with water, and tried to lift it. It slipped, sloshed, and hit the floor with a thud. Zeke appeared in the fountain, doorway, hat in hand. He didn't rush forward, didn't scold. He simply said, "No one's timing you. I can help." He leaned a shoulder against the frame. "You will. Just not this minute." The way he said it, plain, without authority, stung less than kindness. She let go of the bucket. Outside, June's laughter broke the tension. The sound was small, startled, like a bird remembering it could sing. Zeke glanced toward the yard. "Come on, see what she found." Lark stepped carefully to the doorframe, leaning there as her daughter stood in sunlight, arm outstretched toward a horse with one clouded eye. The Mustang chewed lazily on a slice of apple, its ear flicking toward the sound of the creek. June whispered something, and the animal snorted, warm breath fogging the cool air. Zeke's voice carried softly. "Old mare's mean to most folks. Seems she picked her favorite." Lark's lips twitched, almost a smile. "She must see herself in her," she murmured. He looked at her over his shoulder, half smiling back. "Maybe she sees the kid don't scare easy." A light knock broke the quiet. Alma Boyd stood at the fence line again, shawl tight around her shoulders. "Brought you something else," she said, handing over a basket of cornbread and beans. Then, from her pocket, she drew a small string of carved beads. "Shoshone made. Keep it near the doorway. Helps the bad wind pass by." Zeke took it without ceremony, nodded once. Obliged. Alma's eyes rested on Lark, soft but steady, rate slow. Every storm leaves room for something green after. Then she turned and went down the path, her boots tapping steady on stone. Lark traced a bead with her thumb, its surface smooth, cool as river glass. "You believe that?" Zeke said. "Don't matter if I do, maybe you will." She set the beads on the table near the lamp. The smell of beans filled the room. June's laughter drifted in again. For the first time, the cabin felt lived in. Later, as clouds rolled slow from the west, Zeke leaned against the porch rail, watching the light fade to gray. Lark joined him, her steps still uncertain, but no longer afraid. "They'll talk in town," she said quietly. "About me, about you." He nodded. "They talked before you came. They'll keep at it after." A silence stretched between them, long, not empty. Then the sky deepened, and the first drop of rain landed on the rail between their hands. She looked down at it, glimmering in the half-light. He said, "Storms early this year." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe it never left." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth. Lark stepped back, gathering June from the porch as thunder rumbled beyond the ridge. Zeke closed the door behind them, locking out the wind. Inside, the Shoshone beads swayed faintly on the nail, clicking once against the wood. Soft, like a heartbeat finding rhythm again. The rain came slow at first, whispering across the prairie like someone thinking out loud. It traced thin lines down the window, turning the world outside into wavering glass. Lark stood near the sill, shawl around her shoulders, watching the light die out of the afternoon. Every few minutes, thunder rolled far off, soft but steady, like hooves in the distance. She'd spent the morning sweeping the floor, more from pride than strength. Her arms had ached, but it felt good to move again, to earn the sound of her own breath. The cabin smelled of coffee grounds and rain-damp wood, a clean scent that almost disguised the ache in her ribs. When Zeke came in from the corral, his hat dripped, his shoulders slick with rain. He brushed the water off and hung the coat by the door. "Horse don't like thunder," he said. "Can't say I blame her." Lark handed him a towel. "Seems like no one much likes it." He dried his hands, looked at her a long moment. "Thunder don't mean harm. Just warns you something's moving out there." They ate in quiet. Cornbread, beans, the sort of meal that held a man steady after a long day. June, cross-legged on the floor, hummed to herself, braiding a piece of twine around her wrist. Every now and then she looked up, as if to check the grown-ups were still there. The knock came before dusk. Sharp. Too sharp for the storm's rhythm. Zeke opened the door halfway. A man from town, Harlan Price, ranch hand, too much whiskey on his breath, stood under the eave, hat cocked against the rain. His grin didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think you'd start collecting strays, Cole," he said. "Word's traveling fast down at Ember Creek. McCrae boys say you got what's theirs." Zeke's jaw tightened. "You riding all this way to carry gossip?" "Just warning you," Harlan drawled. "Ain't wise mixing your business with theirs." Zeke didn't blink. "I've lived fine with unwise." Harlan laughed, thin and mean. "Suit yourself. Hope you can swim when they come for you." Zeke's eyes met his. The rain streaked down his face like steel wire. "I know how," he said evenly. "Been swimming all my life." The man hesitated. Something in Zeke's tone made him falter. Then he turned, boots splashing through the mud, and disappeared into the gray. Lark had been standing by the hearth. The firelight flickered on her face as she whispered, "You shouldn't have said that." Zeke closed the door, set the latch. "Wouldn't matter if I did or didn't. Some folks need a reason. Others don't wait for one." She stared at him, at the rain dripping from his sleeve. "And you're not afraid?" He met her eyes. "Not of drownin'." Something in the way he said it settled in her chest like a promise she didn't yet understand. Night deepened, filled with the smell of wet soil and smoke. June fell asleep near the fire, clutching her twine bracelet, lips moving in dreams. Lark sat by the window, listening to the steady rhythm of drops. Zeke sat across the room, sharpening a blade, the scrape of metal soft and patient. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. The world shrunk to the sound of rain and breathing. Then lightning split the dark, a flash bright enough to light every scar on her arms. Lark flinched. Zeke looked up but didn't speak. He let the silence hold instead of breaking it. That silence did something words couldn't. It told her he saw without asking. Outside, the storm gathered strength. The Mustang in the corral stamped and snorted. The old fence creaked against the wind. Lark rose, walked to the door, pressed her palm against it. She wasn't sure if she was keeping the world out or herself in. Her voice was small. "Feels like it's coming closer." Zeke stood, crossed the floor, checked the latch again. "It'll pass. They always do." She turned her head slightly. "Do they?" He looked at her, but she wasn't really asking him. She was asking the night. Rain hammered the roof harder, rattling the tin like distant gunfire. June stirred in her sleep. Zeke moved to add wood to the fire. "Best rest while it's still just rain," he said. She watched him kneel by the hearth, his face caught in firelight. The warmth touched the lines of his jaw, the edge of his patience. Somewhere in that quiet, she felt a word rise to her lips, a truth she hadn't dared speak since the McCrae porch. But it stopped short, caught behind her teeth. Thunder answered instead, low and full. The beads Alma had given them swung gently by the door, clicking against the wall. One fell loose and landed on the floor, rolling until it stopped at Lark's bare foot. She bent, picked it up, and held it in her palm. Outside, the storm broke fully, a wall of sound and wind. Zeke looked toward the window. "Long night ahead," he said softly. Lark stared at the single bead, its pale surface glinting in the firelight, and whispered, "Then we'll see who's still standing come morning." The rain swallowed her words whole. The rain didn't stop. It came in sheets that blurred the world beyond the window, drumming on the roof like 1,000 small fists. The cabin breathed with it, the sound threading through every seam of the wood. Lark sat near the hearth, a blanket wrapped tight around her, June asleep in the small bed behind her. The lamplight flickered each time the wind pressed against the shutters. Zeke sat a few feet away, chair tipped back on two legs, the fire painting his face in soft amber. Neither of them had spoken for a long time. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was waiting. Lark's fingers toyed with the single bead she'd found on the floor. The smoothness of it steadied her breathing, gave her something to hold that wasn't fear. Finally, her voice came out low, rough from disuse. You ever wonder what breaks a person first? The hurt, or the quiet that follows it? Zeke didn't answer right away. Sometimes they're the same thing. The rain filled the space where words might have gone. She stared into the fire, watching sparks rise and vanish. When I married into that family, she said, barely more than a whisper, I thought I'd done something right. My father died owing them, and they said they'd take care of me. I believed it. Her throat caught. She took another breath. First came the chores, then the words, then the hands, always when no one looked, and when they did, her voice trembled. They looked away. Zeke's chair came down on all four legs. His hands rested on his knees, steady but still. He didn't interrupt. She drew the blanket closer, the fabric damp at the edges from her grip. I used to count the cracks on the wall while he shouted. 47 by the window, 32 near the front door. I thought if I memorized them all, I could find my way out someday. The fire popped, a spark leaping to the floor. Zeke leaned forward, pressed it out with his boot. You did, he said quietly. Lark shook her head. No, I was thrown out. A long pause followed, the kind that pulls breath from the air. Then she spoke again, slower. The worst part wasn't leaving. It was seeing my little girl watching from the doorway. She didn't cry, she didn't make a sound. Just nothing. Behind them, June shifted in her sleep, murmuring something inaudible. Lark turned, heart twisting. She hasn't said a word since. Zeke's eyes softened. She will. The firelight swayed between them, making their shadows lean toward one another before pulling apart again. Outside, the thunder rolled farther away, but the rain held steady. Lark glanced toward the window, then back at him. You ever lose something you can't bury? He looked at the knife on the table, the steel catching the glow. More than once. She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. His silence wasn't dismissal. It was a shelter. A space where her pain could breathe without being caged by pity. Her hand rose to her temple, rubbing the bruise that had already turned yellow. I can still hear their boots sometimes, she whispered. Boots fade, he said. She looked at him, unsure if he was talking about her ghosts or his own. Do they? He nodded once. If you let the rain wash what's left. The wind rattled the door, hard enough to make the latch tremble. Lark flinched, half rising before she caught herself. Zeke stood, crossed the floor, and pressed the latch down tight. Ain't no one out there, he said. Only the storm. She sank back into her chair. Her shoulders eased, though the tremor in her hands lingered. For a while, the only sound was the rain easing from fury to rhythm. Then, almost too soft to hear, Lark whispered, "You ever scared of being kind to the wrong person?" Zeke turned toward her. "Ain't kindness what ruins us," he said. "It's letting other folks teach us when to give it." Her eyes glistened in the low light. "That's easy to say." "Harder to live," he agreed. She looked at the fire again, the bead still resting in her palm. For the first time, she didn't close her hand around it. She let it sit there, catching light. Outside, the storm began to thin, each drop slower, softer, as if the sky itself was growing tired. June sighed in her sleep. Zeke reached for another log and set it on the fire, the orange glow flaring up just enough to touch her face. Lark lifted her eyes to him. There was something unspoken there. Recognition. Fragile but real. She opened her mouth, but her voice broke. Zeke said quietly, "You ain't gotta finish the story tonight." Her lips pressed together, but she nodded. "Then maybe I'll start again tomorrow." He tipped his hat slightly. "Tomorrow'll wait." A gust of wind swept through the chimney, making the flame bow low, then rise again. Time 700. Lark watched it sway, her heartbeat slowly matching the rhythm of the rain outside. She didn't see June stir, didn't notice the child's head lift just enough to look at her mother's face, eyes wide and shining in the dim light, like she'd heard every word. The rain whispered against the window, softer now, carrying the smell of earth made clean. By dawn, the storm had gone, leaving only the hush that follows something fierce. The air smelled of wet sage and smoke. Sunlight spilled through the window in quiet ribbons, touching the floor where puddles had dried into pale stains. Zeke sat by the hearth, hat resting on his knee, watching the embers breathe in and out. He'd been awake all night, listening to the roof drip, to the rhythm of two other hearts sleeping under his roof. One broken, one too young to know how deep that break ran. Lark stirred on the cot, hair loose, face turned toward the light. The bruises had faded from blue to brown, and her lips had regained a faint color. Her hand lay near June's, the two palms almost touching, but not quite. June's lashes fluttered, her small face half hidden beneath the quilt. For a long moment, she just watched her mother breathe, as if testing the sound of life in the room. Then, without meaning to, she whispered, "Mama." The word was soft, fragile as the air itself. It cracked the silence like light through thin glass. Lark's eyes opened. For a heartbeat, she thought she'd dreamed it. Then June said it again, barely louder, her voice uncertain but real. "Mama." Lark froze, then sat up too fast, pressing a hand to her chest, as though steadying her heart. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "Say it again," she whispered. June blinked, her lips trembling. "Mama." The sound broke something open inside Lark, something that had been waiting since the day she fell in the dirt outside the McCrae porch. She gathered the child into her arms, clutching her tight, trembling so hard the blanket slipped to the floor. Zeke looked away. His jaw flexed once, his eyes finding the fire instead. The glow washed over him, warm and unbearable. Lark buried her face in her daughter's hair, whispering words without shape, sobs that carried more gratitude than pain. June's small hands patted her mother's back, uncertain, but she didn't pull away. The child's breath came soft against her neck. Outside, the land shone with the afterglow of rain. The prairie grass bent under beads of water, each drop catching the sun like scattered glass. A lone hawk circled above, slow, unhurried. When Lark finally lifted her head, her face was streaked with tears, but steady. She hadn't said anything since that night, she managed. Zeke nodded once. She found her moment. Lark looked at him through her tears. Why now? He studied the fire a moment longer before answering. Maybe she heard you talk last night. Maybe she knew it was safe again to make a sound. Those words hung in the air, quiet and weighty. Lark's throat tightened. She touched June's hair, then looked down at her own hands. Hands that had once flinched from every noise, now holding something precious without fear. June leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her thumb resting in her mouth. She had no idea what she'd done, but the peace that settled in the room was new, deep as river water. Zeke rose and opened the door. The wind that came in was cool, carrying the scent of rain-soaked dirt and the far-off call of cattle. "Sun's out," he said. "Good day to start mendin' fences." Lark smiled faintly through her tears. "I suppose there's plenty to mend." "Always is," he said. He stepped outside, boots sinking into soft mud. The ground gave under his heel but held. Time 600 pems. Behind him, laughter, light, uncertain, like the first sound after a long silence, rose from inside the cabin. He stopped on the porch, his hand resting on the post. The warmth from that sound followed him out into the light. He tilted his head up, watching the sky clear, the last clouds drifting east. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel like it was closing in. Inside, Lark watched him through the open door. The sight of his back, broad, still, framed against the sunlight, sent a strange calm through her. He hadn't asked her to stay. He hadn't told her to go. He just kept the door open. She whispered almost to herself, "He's the quiet kind of safe." June tugged at her sleeve, eyes bright now. "Mama," she said again, and the word this time came easier. Lark laughed softly, hugging her close. The sound of a hammer echoed outside. Zeke driving a nail into a loose board, steady, rhythmic. It was the kind of sound that marked a place as lived in. Lark stood, feeling the ache in her legs, but also something stronger, a pull toward the day ahead. She stepped to the doorway, leaned on the frame, and watched the morning stretch across the land. The sky was still gray at the edges, but sunlight reached down, catching the wet fields in thin gold lines. She could see her reflection faintly in the window pane. Tired, bruised, but alive. She whispered, more to the light than anyone, "We'll be all right, won't we?" And somewhere outside, as if the land itself replied, the wind shifted through the grass, soft and sure. Behind her, June's small voice followed. "Mama?" "Yes, baby." "Can we go outside?" "Time 600 mums." Lark smiled through the tears she hadn't wiped away. "Not yet. Soon." The light climbed higher, and in its warmth, the sound of Zeke's hammer paused for a moment, then struck once more. Steady, patient, certain. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in every breath, reminding them that peace was something built, not found. No one spoke of the word the child had said, but the air in that cabin had changed. It would never be silent in the same way again. And somewhere, far beyond the ridge, the faint dust of the McCrae Trail lifted under a dry wind, as if the past itself was stirring once more. The sky at noon was too bright, the kind that bleached the horizon and left no place to hide. Heat shimmered above the pasture, bending the air like glass. Zeke Cole set down his hammer, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and squinted toward the ridge. He heard them before he saw them. 3 riders, their horses cutting slow through the tall grass, the sound of hooves dull against the baked earth. Dust trailed behind them like a second shadow. Lark was at the window, her hand still on a thread she'd been mending. June sat on the floor, stacking smooth stones she'd gathered by the creek. The faint echo of hooves made the child look up, and something in Lark's face told her to stay quiet. Zeke stepped onto the porch. The air felt heavy, charged, the way it does before lightning. He could already tell who they were by the way they sat their saddles. Straight, sure, mean. The McCrae boys and the old man himself, riding in the middle. When they drew close enough to see his face, the eldest reined in his horse. "Cole," he called, "we come for what's ours." Zeke didn't answer. He kept his hand resting on the post, the other near his belt, but not on his gun. Lark moved behind him in the doorway, one arm around June. The sight of those men, the same faces that had watched her fall to the dirt without lifting a hand, brought a tremor to her body. Her breath hitched, but she didn't hide. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the older McCrae said. "You know she belongs back with her kin." Zeke's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something quieter, heavier. "She belongs where she's safe." The second brother spat into the dust. "You think you can play savior, Cole? Ain't your kind's place." Zeke's stillness was like stone. The insult slid past him without ripple, but his silence carried the weight of a loaded rifle. The youngest shifted uneasily, glancing at the others. Inside, June clung tighter to her mother's dress. Lark's voice trembled. "You should go," she said to the men outside. "There's nothing left of me back there." The eldest laughed. "You're breathing, ain't you? That's more than you'd be without us." Zeke stepped down from the porch, slow and deliberate. The dust stirred at his boots. "You've had your say," he said. "Now turn your horses and ride." The old man sneered. You talk big for someone standing alone. Zeke's voice stayed calm. I ain't alone. The three riders exchanged glances. The silence stretched, the air hot and tense. Even the flies had stopped buzzing. One of the horses stamped, breaking the spell. The eldest shifted in the saddle. You think we won't come back? Zeke looked up at him, the sun carving the edge of his hat brim into shadow. You already came, he said, and you'll ride out the same way. The man's mouth twisted, but he didn't move forward. Something in Zeke's stance, his unflinching calm, the quiet certainty of his gaze, made the moment tilt. The eldest pulled the reins hard, spitting a curse. You'll regret this, Cole. Folks'll say you took what wasn't yours. Let 'em, Zeke said. The McCrae brothers wheeled their horses, muttering. The old man lingered a moment longer, his eyes hard and small. Ain't done yet, he said, then turned and rode after his sons. Their hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the heat shimmer. Zeke stayed where he was until the dust settled. Only then did he turn back toward the house. Lark stood framed in the doorway, pale but unbroken. June peered from behind her, eyes wide but dry. You shouldn't have, Lark whispered. Would you rather I hadn't? He asked. Her throat worked before she could speak. They'll come back. He nodded once. Then I'll be here when they do. She looked at him for a long time, seeing not the danger, but the stillness in him. The way he stood without swagger, without noise, just the quiet promise of someone who didn't move unless it mattered. Inside, June tugged on her sleeve. Mama, she whispered. Are they gone? Lark bent down, smoothing the child's hair. For now. Zeke stepped back onto the porch. His eyes followed the trail of dust disappearing into the horizon. They'll talk in town, he said quietly. But talk don't change what's true. What's that? She asked. That you don't owe them any more. The words sank deep, heavier than any kindness she'd known. She turned them over in her mind, but before she could answer, a gust of hot wind swept through, slamming the loose shutter against the wall. The sound startled June. She clung to her mother again. Lark looked up at Zeke, heart pounding. Not from fear, but from something new, something close to recognition. Neither spoke. The wind eased. A hawk cried somewhere far off, the sound thin and sharp against the wide sky. And in that stretched silence, Lark took half a step forward. Zeke, she said, steady now. I'm not theirs. He turned, but before he could answer, the wind caught her hair and lifted it across her face. For a moment, sunlight flared between them, golden and blinding. And then it was gone. The day held its breath after the riders left. The dust they'd raised hung in the air like smoke refusing to clear. Zeke stood a long while in the yard, hands loose at his sides, hat shadowing his eyes. The sound of their hooves had faded down the ridge, but the echo of threat stayed behind, crouched in the silence. Lark stepped down from the porch. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet. June clung to the doorframe, half hidden, her small fingers gripping the wood. The light cut sharp between them all, drawing lines that seemed to divide the world into what had been and what might be. "They'll be back," she said. Her voice wasn't trembling this time. It was low, measured, like she'd decided something while he wasn't looking. Zeke turned his head slightly toward her. "Maybe." Lark's gaze drifted over the yard, the trampled grass, the faint print of horseshoes in the mud. "They think I'm a thing," she murmured. "Something a man can trade or send back when he's done." She looked at him then, directly. "You don't think that way, do you?" Zeke's answer came slow. "I think people are what they stand for, not what they're called." Her chin lifted a little. "Then hear me clear, Zeke Cole." She stepped closer until her shadow brushed his. "I'm not theirs, but I'm not yours either." The wind picked that moment to rise, tugging her hair across her face, making her words sound fiercer than they were. Still, they hung there, bold and trembling, as if spoken not just to him, but to the open world. Zeke didn't move. The air between them stretched taut. Then, after a breath too long to measure, he nodded once. Fair enough. It wasn't the answer she expected. No defense, no persuasion, just acceptance. It unsettled her more than anger might have. "I mean it," she said, her voice catching. "I can't be saved again." Zeke looked out toward the horizon, his tone quiet. "Didn't plan on saving you. Just didn't like seeing folks act like they owned breath that wasn't theirs." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any grand speech. She felt her throat tighten, but she didn't look away. From behind, June's small voice broke the stillness. "Mama," she called softly, testing the sound again, as if reminding them both what had already changed. Lark turned, smiling through the ache in her chest. "It's all right, baby." Zeke bent to pick up his hat from where he'd dropped it earlier, shaking off the dust. When he looked back, his eyes met hers for a brief moment that said more than either dared speak aloud. "You'll want to stay close to the house for a while," he said. "Town'll have plenty to say." "I've lived under words before," she replied. "They can't bruise like fists do." He gave a faint half-smile, more weary than amused. "Still stings, though." She didn't argue. Instead, she bent down and gathered June into her arms. The child's face pressed against her shoulder, safe and small. Zeke watched them for a moment, then turned back to the corral. He moved slow, steady, the way a man does when he needs motion to quiet the noise inside him. Lark stayed by the porch, following his outline against the white sky. Time 600 moms. She couldn't read what lived behind his silence, but she knew this much. He wouldn't try to own her, and somehow that made her want to stay. By evening, the town began to whisper. Ember Creek always did when it smelled scandal. Men at the mercantile shook their heads. Women at the well murmured under their breath. Alma Boyd heard it all and said nothing. But the sound carried over the hills like a restless wind, crawling toward Coal Ridge. Inside the cabin, Zeke mended a harness by the fire while June sorted her stones in a small line on the floor. Lark sat by the window, the last gold of dusk slipping over her face. She wasn't hiding anymore. Every now and then she caught Zeke watching her reflection in the glass. Not with desire, but with a kind of reverence that made her heart beat unevenly. "You ever get tired of silence?" she asked, not turning. He pulled the thread tight on the leather strap. "Not when it's honest." Lark looked down at her hands, tracing the faint scars that still lined her wrists. "Then maybe that's what this is," she whispered. "The first honest silence I've had in years." He didn't answer, but the fire popped once, and it felt like the world agreed. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of a horse on the distant road. Zeke's head lifted, eyes narrowing. Lark noticed, her breath catching. "Just a traveler," he said after a moment, though his hand rested quietly near the rifle by the door. She nodded, but the unease stayed. In the window's reflection, she saw him framed by firelight, strong and still, like part of the cabin itself. She realized then that safety wasn't something given. It was something built, one quiet act at a time. June yawned, curling up on the rug, her hand still clutching a smooth white stone. Lark stood, pulled the quilt from the chair, and covered her gently. Her fingers brushed the child's cheek, then lingered there. "Sleep, little bird," she whispered. Zeke set the harness aside and looked toward them. The lamplight caught the edge of his profile. Tired, thoughtful. "You should rest too," he said softly. "I will," she murmured. But she didn't. Long after he banked the fire and stepped outside to check the horses, she sat by the window, listening to the faint rhythm of his boots on the porch. Beyond the fence line, in the half-dark, a single silhouette paused. A man on horseback, watching the cabin from afar. Lark's eyes narrowed. The figure didn't move. The Mustang in the corral stamped once, uneasy. Zeke turned his head toward the sound, his shoulders tightening. When he looked back to the ridge, the rider was gone. Inside, the lamplight trembled. Lark's hand moved to the beads hanging by the door, the wood still cool under her fingertips. She whispered to the quiet, "Not theirs, not anyone's." And for the first time, she almost believed it. The next afternoon carried a brittle light, thin as the skin of milk. Ember Creek moved through its usual rhythm. Men stacking feed, women hanging wash, gossip threading between them like wind through wire. The McCrae name passed from mouth to mouth, followed now by Zeke Coles. By the time Lark and June stepped into town, heads were already turning. Lark wore her shawl pulled close, June's small hand tucked into hers. She didn't hide, but every step felt like walking through dust that wanted to cling. At the Mercantile, the chatter dimmed when the doorbell rang. Alma Boyd stood at the counter with a sack of flour, her gray eyes calm and unflinching. "Afternoon, Lark," she said, as if greeting any other neighbor. Lark hesitated, then nodded. "Afternoon." The storekeeper, Mr. Crane, fumbled with the scales. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon." "I needed sugar," she said. And courage goes better with coffee. A faint chuckle came from Alma. The others said nothing. Behind them, a whisper. That's her. The one Cole took in. June pressed closer to her mother. Lark counted out the coins, her hands steady though her stomach knotted. She could feel every gaze like a touch she hadn't asked for. When they left, Alma followed them to the porch. She held out a small jar wrapped in cloth. Chamomile and sage, she said. Steep it at night. Helps the heart rest. Lark blinked back the sudden sting behind her eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me, Alma said. Just keep standing. They walked home under the low sun, the weight of stairs trailing behind them. By the time Cole Ridge came into view, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of pine resin and rain somewhere far off. Zeke was in the yard mending the fence. He looked up as they approached. Town treat you fair? Town treated us like news, Lark said. He grunted. Could have been worse. News fades faster than truth. June wandered toward the corral, chasing a chicken that had strayed too close. The Mustang stood watching, one eye milky, the other alert. The old mare lowered her head, letting the child pat her muzzle. June's got a friend now, Lark said quietly. Zeke hammered another nail, the sound echoing sharp. Horse don't trust easy, takes time. She learns from the best, Lark said before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, expression unreadable. That a compliment? Maybe. A soft smile ghosted across his face. I'll take it. Inside, the cabin smelled of soap and wood smoke. Lark unpacked the sugar, the herbs, and a bundle of flour someone had slipped into her sack. Extra, unpaid for. She knew it was Alma's doing. The kindness cut deeper than cruelty ever had. June hummed at the table, drawing crooked lines on scrap paper with a dull pencil. Zeke entered, wiping his hands on a rag. Fence'll hold another season, he said, if we keep at it. Lark poured hot water over the herbs. The scent filled the room. Earthy, gentle. Seems like everything here needs mending. Always has, he replied. The sound of hooves passed faintly on the road below. Zeke glanced toward the window, then returned to his chair. Word'll reach the McCraes that you came to town, he said. I figured. You worried? She considered that. I used to be. He nodded, as if that answer pleased him. That's good. As dusk settled, Alma's tea cooled in their cups. Lark sat near the hearth. June nestled against her lap, half asleep. Zeke leaned back in his chair, hat low over his brow, the lines on his hands catching the firelight. You ever think, Lark said softly, that quiet's the loudest thing there is? He tipped his hat up. Sometimes it's the only thing that tells the truth. Her eyes followed the flames. Then maybe we've both been lying to ourselves a long time. Zeke didn't answer, but she saw his hands clench once on his knee, then release. The moment stretched thin, full of things almost spoken. The wind brushed the window. The Mustang snorted outside, restless. Zeke rose, added a log to the fire, and said without turning, Some nights, quiet's just another word for waitin'. Lark looked at him, the question rising before she could stop it. Waitin' for what? He didn't look back. For when the past stops knockin'. The flames crackled between them. Lark studied the back of his shoulders, the strength there, the sorrow she'd only guessed at. Something in her understood that his silence wasn't peace. It was penance. Later, when June slept and the fire burned low, Zeke sat alone at the table, turning his hat in his hands. His thumb traced a worn scar along the brim, back and forth, like a habit that wouldn't die. Lark watched from her chair, pretending to drowse. The movement caught the light, and for the first time she saw the faraway look in his eyes. The kind a man wears when he's remembering what he couldn't fix. He noticed her watching and gave a faint, almost shy smile. "Old hat," he said. "Hard to let go." She smiled back, though her chest ached with curiosity she didn't dare voice. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, almost a confession. "There's things I ain't said, Lark. Things about why I keep to myself." She met his gaze. "Then say them, when you can." He nodded once. "Maybe soon." Outside, the wind rose, and the last light of the fire brushed his face like a secret about to surface. The night settled heavy over the ridge, thick with the smell of pine smoke and cooling earth. A pale moon hung above the barn roof, its light sliding through the cracks of the cabin wall like spilled milk. Inside, the fire was low, whispering instead of burning. Zeke sat by it, elbows on his knees, the brim of his hat casting his face in shadow. The same scarred hat he'd held the night before. His thumb traced the worn edge again and again, as though memory lived in the leather. Lark stirred from her chair, half asleep, and spoke softly. "You'll wear a hole in that hat if you keep it up." He didn't look at her, but the corner of his mouth lifted. "Wouldn't be the first hole I made by holding on too long." Something in his tone made her straighten. "You talk like a man waiting to confess to God." Zeke's eyes stayed on the fire. "Maybe I am. Just don't know if he still listens." Lark leaned forward, the light touching her face. "I'd say he's listening fine. Might even be us he's listening through." Zeke exhaled, a sound almost like a laugh, but stripped of humor. "You think he'd use me for that?" "I think he's used worse," she said, then paused. "Tell me what you keep seeing when you stare into those flames." For a long time he didn't answer. The only sound was the crack of sap in the wood, the faint rustle of wind outside. Then he said, low and steady, "A long while back, there was a fire at the Mason Spread, down south, near the Brazos. I rode with their outfit a few years. Hard men, but fair. One summer storm rolled in. Lightning caught the hay barn. Before we could get close, the wind took it." He swallowed. The words came slower now, rough like dry rope. "There was a girl inside. She'd gone in after her father's horse. We saw the light, heard her call. I ran in." Lark's breath caught. "I got close enough to see her," he said. "Hair caught fire like dry grass. I reached, but the beam came down before I could get to her." I came out with half my coat burned and nothing in my hands. He rubbed the edge of his palm against his thigh, as if the old burn still lived there. I told myself she was already gone when I ran in, but I don't know if that's true. Been seeing that look on her face ever since. One that asks, why so late? The silence that followed felt alive, breathing between them. Lark's eyes shone in the firelight. And that's why you keep to yourself, she said softly. You think if you stay still, no one else gets lost. Zeke's jaw tightened. Men like me, we don't get to fix much. We just keep fences mended and fires low. You did fix something, she said. You brought me out of the dirt. He shook his head. You were getting up before I got there. I just gave the ground less hold on you. The humility in his voice was almost painful. Lark leaned closer, searching his face. Zeke, that girl in the fire, she ain't waiting on you no more. He didn't answer. His eyes reflected the flames, the orange light catching a flicker of something between guilt and grief. Outside, the Mustang whinnied, unsettled by the wind. Lark stood and crossed the small space between them. She stopped just short of touching him, her hand hovering near his shoulder. The firelight painted the air between them in gold and shadow. You carry that pain like it's the only thing that keeps you upright, she whispered. But maybe it's just what keeps you alone. Zeke lifted his gaze to hers, and for the first time, she saw it fully. The weariness, the quiet ache of a man who'd forgiven everyone but himself. He said, almost pleading, "Don't try to make it right. It's done." She shook her head. "No, it ain't. You still bleed from it." The words cut through the still air. He looked away, but she saw the tremor in his hand. Then, for the first time, his voice broke. "I keep thinking if I'd been a breath faster, a step sooner, maybe she'd have lived. Maybe I'd be worth what people think I am." The admission hung there, raw and human. Lark swallowed hard. Worth don't come from saving people, Zeke. It comes from staying when it'd be easier to leave. His eyes flickered to hers again. Uncertain, grateful, afraid all at once. For a heartbeat, the distance between them felt like the edge of a cliff, one step away from something that could change both their lives. Lark reached out, her hand trembling in the warm light. But halfway there, she stopped, just inches from his skin. He didn't move, just watched her hand hang in the air between them, fingers open like a question waiting for an answer. The fire popped, scattering sparks across the hearth. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, far, but coming closer. Zeke's voice quiet as the settling ash. "You ought to rest." Lark drew her hand back slowly, the space between them closing without touch. "Maybe," she whispered, "but not yet." And the wind outside sighed through the eaves, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere far off, as if the past itself had stirred awake. The night deepened until the fire was little more than a pulse of amber in the hearth. Zeke sat still, the weight of his confession sinking into the floorboards, into the silence that followed. Outside, the wind had quieted, carrying only the faint whisper of cottonwoods along the creek. Lark hadn't moved for a long time. Her hand still hovered in the space where she'd almost touched him. The air between them felt alive, fragile as a held breath. She could hear the fire's soft crackle, the slow rhythm of his breathing, and beneath it, the ache that had no words. Finally, she rose. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, brushing the floor. Barefoot, she stepped closer to him. Zeke didn't look up, but she knew he felt her presence. The way his hand stilled on his knee, the way his jaw tightened, as if bracing for something he didn't think he deserved. She knelt beside him, close enough that the edge of her dress touched his boot. The firelight trembled across both their faces. Then, with a courage that surprised even her, she placed her hand over his, lightly, gently, like one might touch a wound that's almost healed but still tender. Zeke froze. His hand was rough, scarred, warm from the fire. He didn't pull away, not yet. Lark's voice came quiet. No one gets to come in time for every fire. Sometimes all we can do is carry the ones we did reach. His breath hitched, the sound small but sharp. He turned his hand under hers, just enough that their palms met. The contact was nothing dramatic, only the weight of two lives finally touching after too long spent apart from the world. He spoke, his voice breaking low. I kept thinking maybe I wasn't meant to save anyone. You were, she said. Just not the way you thought. He looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes softer now, the light of the fire reflecting in them like dawn over water. Lark gave a small, trembling smile. You saved me when you stopped me from disappearing. You saved June when you said nothing but stayed. Zeke's throat worked before he could speak. You make it sound easy. Nothing about it's easy, she whispered. That's what makes it worth it. They stayed that way a long time, the fire breathing around them, the night holding steady beyond the walls. Behind them, June stirred in her sleep and murmured something. A name, half dream, half waking. Zeke, she said softly, then went quiet again. The sound struck him harder than any word ever had. He blinked, the corners of his mouth pulling into a faint, disbelieving smile. She said my name. Lark nodded, eyes glistening. Seems the whole house decided to forgive you tonight. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Don't know if I earned that. Maybe forgiveness ain't earned, she said. Maybe it's just received. Zeke looked at the small sleeping form by the bed, then back at Lark. Something inside him loosened. Years of guilt, of running, of silence finally losing their grip. He covered her hand with his, steady and sure now. Thank you, he said simply. She shook her head. Don't thank me. Just live. He nodded once, the simplest promise a man could give. The fire popped, casting sparks upward like tiny prayers that refused to die. They sat there side by side until the flames dimmed to coals. When at last he leaned back, eyes heavy, she stayed near. their shoulders nearly touching. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the quiet. Outside, dawn was coming. The pale horizon carried a faint blush, the color of smoke cooling into morning. Zeke stirred, glancing toward the window. "Sun's comin'." Lark smiled faintly. "It can take its time." He reached for his hat, resting it on his knee again. "Tomorrow, we'll ride to the chapel." Her brows lifted. "The chapel?" He nodded. "Figure if I'm stayin', best make it known proper. You and the girl deserve a name folks can't twist." Lark's eyes filled before she could speak. "You sure?" He met her gaze, calm and certain. "Ain't much I'm sure of in this world, but this, I'm sure." The last of the fire sighed into ash. Lark stood, brushed her hands against her dress, then looked down at him with a softness that carried every road they'd both walked to reach this point. "Then I'll sew a ribbon for June," she said. "Something bright for the day." He smiled, a rare, full smile that made him look younger, almost unburdened. "She'll like that." The window lightened, silver bleeding into gold. Lark stepped closer to the door, feeling the cool air creep in. For the first time since she'd come to this place, the world didn't seem like something to flee. It felt wide, open, alive. Behind her, Zeke's voice was low but clear. "Thank you for staying, Lark." She turned, her eyes soft. "Thank you for letting me." And as morning broke over Coal Ridge, the old cabin glowed like something reborn. Its quiet not empty anymore, but full of breath and promise. The chapel was small and bright with dust and pine light. Morning spilled through the windows, soft as breath. Lark stood by the door, June's hand in hers, the Shoshone beads resting cool against her throat. Her dress was plain, her heart steady. Zeke waited near the front, hat against his chest, clean-shaven except for one nick that made him look almost shy. Alma Boyd sat in the front pew. O'Rourke leaned on the wall. Rosita guided June forward with a bright ribbon. The preacher, thin, kind-eyed, spoke gently. "We're here to name what's already true, a promise to stay." Lark and Zeke faced each other. Between them, June's small fingers reached out, joining their hands before words began. The preacher smiled. "Some vows come early." Zeke spoke first, his voice deep and quiet. "I can't give riches, just my back and my time. I'll stand when the wind comes hard. I'll keep the door open, the fire slow to die." Lark answered, her tone trembling but clear. "I'm not anyone's to own, but I'll walk beside you. I'll keep ghosts from the door, and I'll choose kindness first, when I don't know what else to do." Their hands tightened. 3 palms, one rough, one small, one scarred, closed like a door against every storm. Through the open window, a red hawk circled the sky. The preacher nodded once. "Then it's done." They stepped outside into a noon so clean it hurt to breathe. The townsfolk watched from porches. Some soft-eyed, some still sharp, but no one spoke. Zeke lifted June onto his hip. The child rested her head on his shoulder, ribbon bright in her hair. Lark walked beside him, steps light but firm, as if each one claimed a little more of the earth beneath her. At the edge of town, the road widened toward the ridge. Coal Ridge waited, the roof gleaming like a coin in the distance. The wind carried the smell of rain that hadn't yet begun. June pointed. "Home," she said. They walked slow, unhurried. Zeke brushed Lark's sleeve. She let her hand fall over his knuckles. A silence, warm and full, stretched between them. Behind them, gossip thinned to murmurs. Ahead, the land opened like a promise. A single drop touched Lark's cheek. Cool, gentle. She laughed under her breath and looked up. Rain came soft and silver, enough to bless, but not to blur. June tilted her face to it. Zeke closed his eyes and smiled. They walked through the rain together. 3 shadows, 1 road, no fear, while the hawk wheeled high above Ember Creek, and the day unfolded before them, wide and clean as a new life. As the dust of Ember Creek settles and the rain drifts gently across the wide plains, the story of Zeke, Lark, and little June reminds us that it's never too late for kindness to find its way home. Their quiet courage, born not from strength but from tenderness, speaks to the truth many of us have learned through the years, that love often arrives not with thunder, but with the steady warmth of someone who chooses to stay. If this tale touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Tell us what part of their journey reminded you of your own. A memory, a person, or a time when forgiveness changed everything. We'd love to hear your reflections and stories. Please remember to like this video if it brought you peace, and subscribe so you'll never miss the next story of hope, compassion, and quiet strength. Every week, we share more Western tales filled with humanity and grace, stories that remind us that even in Shansun, the wide, wild West, the softest hearts can carry the greatest courage. Thank you for listening, friends. May your days ahead be calm, warm, and kind.